So we're going to do a virtual field trip today. Just let me know at any time if the internet gets wonky or if you guys can't hear me. I'll keep monitoring chat. So it would be really great if you all could come here at some point after the pandemic to see this in person. I would have loved to take you to see this in person, but we're doing the best we can. So when you walk into this place, there's a giant mural that shows some of the geography of the Mississippi River and coastal Louisiana. And it's showing you how closely we are connected to the water where we live. So if you are looking out towards the barrier islands and the coast of Louisiana, you can see how close these settlements are to sea level. So obviously they're very much impacted by the tides. And even as we get up here closer to a city like New Orleans, New Orleans itself is also pretty close to sea level and is pretty much only protected from flooding by the levees. You can see these mounds of levees around the Mississippi River here. So this is why flooding is so important, and understanding the impacts of the Mississippi River on the ecology and the human aspects of this region, the culture, is so important. So I definitely want you guys to have that perspective when you leave this course. Now in Baton Rouge, we're kind of up on a high portion. So we don't have to worry so much about flooding by the Mississippi River where we are, though of course you know that sea level is rising. And you'll also see throughout this tour of this area that we are on land that is subsiding. And so you know that we do have flooding problems as well. And long term, this area could indeed see some flooding problems from Mississippi, though right now that's not an immediate concern. So there's this, right across the way here, there's this big, beautiful mural of the Mississippi River watershed. And so we talk a lot about the Mississippi River in this course because we have the mouth of the Mississippi River here in Louisiana. But it's important to remember that this river is really important for the entire United States and Canada because over 40% of the United States drains into the Mississippi River through this watershed. So all that light colored area that you see there is the Mississippi River watershed. So all the water that we get flowing through Louisiana is coming from all of those different portions of our country. You learned about delta switching, which is the way that over time the delta has moved to different areas along coastal Louisiana and built up land. And then as the delta switches to a different lobe, you see land loss in the area that was built up previously. And so this is a natural process, but of course, in order to live in this area, we've had to channelize the Mississippi River so we don't constantly experience flooding and delta switching into areas that are occupied by humans. And there have been unintended consequences of channelizing the Mississippi River. And so these unintended consequences have been land loss in areas where we would prefer it not to happen. So especially along our coast. This image here is showing you in red the areas that have been, the areas that have experienced land loss. And then if you see a couple of areas in green, those are areas that are experiencing gains in land. So very few areas are experiencing land building. You can see down here in the Birdfoot Delta area. And then we talked a little bit about the Wax Lake Delta area. So these are areas that are experiencing land gains. All the rest is being eroded away. And so there's a lot of sediment in the Mississippi River. And you might be wondering, if that's not going to build land, where is it going? And in fact, it is going out into the Gulf of Mexico, where it's no good for building any sort of coastal land. And so a lot of people have been thinking about this problem, about the unintended consequences of channelizing the Mississippi River, and rethinking if this is even a really good idea, if perhaps that we could rethink the channelization of the Mississippi River and get some of this sediment back into our coastal estuaries so it can build land. So of course, with land loss, with sea level rise, with erosion, comes disappearing wetlands. If you've ever driven to New Orleans, you probably have seen your fair share of dead trees, dead swamp along the road there. So this is not an unfamiliar sight for us. So this is what we would expect in an area that's experiencing flooding. So we have these cypress forests, and you can see cypress trees are the ones that have these beautiful skirt-like roots at the bottom. And they provide us evidence where our coastline once was. And people have been able to see changes in these cypress forests even throughout their lifetime in terms of where they're located, which is further evidence that our shoreline is changing. So what are we going to do about this problem? So part of your final project is to talk about land loss in Louisiana and try and develop some solutions, or at least explain some solutions of your own that might address this land loss. There are a lot of different ways that we can address land loss in Louisiana. And one of them is to rethink the channelization of the Mississippi River. So in this image, you can see a bunch of different areas where the Army Corps and folks in Louisiana are expecting to divert the water from the Mississippi back into the marshland so it can aid in the growth of new land. The current route of the Mississippi River is the blue squiggly. And you can see previous routes of the Mississippi River in like the gray light colored areas. And I'm going to bring you a little closer so you can see the locations of all of these diversions that they're proposing. So there's a lot of different areas where essentially the Army Corps is going to punch a hole in the Mississippi River. This is going to be controlled, so they'll be able to open and close these areas and allow sediment and water to go into the marsh and build up land. And we'll talk more in class about what this would look like and what some consequences of this might be. But this is one of the solutions that you might decide to talk about for your final project. There's also been a lot of restoration projects. And so this giant wall, this is my favorite wall in the whole place, is showing you all of the different restoration projects that have taken place in coastal Louisiana. So these would be marsh building efforts, rejuvenation of barrier islands, creation of oyster reefs. I'll show you what some of these pins might mean. I'll try and give you a different perspective too, so you might be able to see the pins a little better. And so they're like push pins on this wall to show you where all these projects are. And the different projects are listed here. And so they have structural protection, so building structures to protect areas from being eroded, hydrologic restoration, restoring water flow, diverting sediment, creating marshes, creating ridges, shoreline protection, oyster reef, and barrier island restoration. So this is, at the same time as we're talking about these river diversions, we're also talking about doing these restoration projects. And as you might expect, these also have unintended consequences, and we'll talk about those in class. But this might be another direction you go for your final project, talking about some marsh restoration projects. And it's really important with all of these restoration efforts that we're able to monitor any sort of changes in land, hopefully land growth or land building. And so there are these monitoring stations all throughout coastal Louisiana. They're called CRMS stations, CRMS, Coastwide Reference Monitoring System. And there are scientists that go around to each one of these stations and they're tracking land building or land loss in these locations. And they use airboats like this one to get to these locations, which are usually high in the marsh. And so they have to traverse a bunch of shallow water and a bunch of marsh to get to these locations. So this is a nice model of a CRIM site here at the River Center. The River Center, if you've never been here, the River Center is actually in a like new kind of corporate industrial campus that's just north of LSU campus. And we call this the Water Campus. And the idea is to bring together the best minds in the region, in the world, to talk about how we're going to restore our coast. And so the idea of this campus is to innovate, build, and sustain our coastal land. And so there are a lot of different ways that different people are getting involved. Academics are getting involved in some of the planning and monitoring of the different restoration projects. And then you as citizens, if you're interested in this stuff, can get involved with some of the restoration projects yourself if you're interested. So just let me know if this is something that you're interested in. I can let you know some of the different opportunities that might be around. And that's a tour of the downstairs. So we're going to go with Joe. You go by Joe? Yes. Upstairs to see the river model now. So I'll take the camera off so you don't get seasick. All right, I'm gonna turn video back on. Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Adam, do you have a question?
No, sorry, I meant to put the thumbs up.
It's okay, I thought that might be the case. Okay, so this is the river model. And Joe's gonna tell us a little bit about the river model. I'm gonna pass over the microphone to him.
Hi guys, so I'm Joseph. Welcome to the LSU Center for River Studies. So we've kind of done a little tour of the downstairs exhibit space, but really the main reason that we have this facility here is to operate this large physical model of the Mississippi River. And so kind of talk a little bit about some of the details while we're using it. So actually we might want to walk over to this first map over here to kind of get a better understanding. So this is a map of the actual physical model domain. So the actual outline areas of Louisiana. Obviously you can see the white model down there, but it may be a little hard, especially on camera, to familiarize yourself with what actually area that is researching. So our model starts at Donaldsonville, Louisiana, which is where I'm pointing here. So Baton Rouge would be a little further up there. Then we come to the city of New Orleans, and you can see Lake Pontchartrain here. And then obviously the Mississippi River is what we're studying. So a couple hundred miles of the Mississippi River there. And so Port Fourchon is here, Grand Isle's here, and Chafalaya, some of those basin areas are over there. So a huge portion of particularly the southeast part of the coast. And so as you were learning about downstairs about the restoration efforts and land loss, one of the most important projects that we're researching are called sediment diversions. And the whole idea is to reconnect the Mississippi River back to the wetlands, right? So historically, almost all of this land over time was built up by the Mississippi River. It used to snake back and forth. Maybe some of the exhibit pictures you could see kind of helped explain that, but the river is responsible for the sediment and the water for building up a large part of our coast and then the subsequent wetlands. Now, when we built levees, we essentially channelized the river and secured it to ensure two things: navigation and flood protection. Now, when we did that, we essentially stopped that natural sedimentation that was occurring, right? So if you can see, actually, this picture is a good example of that. All of that sediment, that muddy sediment laden water is only exiting at the very end of the Mississippi River. But these areas like here are being fragmented. They've got canals dug through them, saltwater intrusions occurring, subsidence is happening. And you can see those areas are slowly becoming open pockets of water and the marsh is dying away. And so the sediment diversions are a large scale restoration, expensive, billions of dollars worth of infrastructure going to build channelized conveyance channels that would allow sediment and water to go from the river in a safe way out into the marsh. And so, in short, the physical model is a way that we can study those projects long before we build them, and to get a sense of how they're going to impact the Mississippi River. So with that, we'll keep moving on to the next little exhibit. So there's basically three parts of the physical model, three, I guess, main ingredients. The first of which is the actual white material. So if we were to go downstairs and get close to the model, you could actually see this hard surface here where we actually form the channel it's a high density foam. That's what the model is actually made up of. And it was carved using a CNC router. So almost like the reverse of 3D printing. And it was based on actual survey data. So, the individual points and elevations, all that according to how it exists in the real world. The second ingredient is, it may be hard to tell from here, but we'll kind of turn towards the model, is just water. So we have probably 5,000 to 6,000 gallons of water sitting out on top of the model. As of right now, you can kind of see that maybe a little bit of shine there. So we fill up water at sea level, and it fills in all those areas of the coast that actually has water. And then the last ingredient, most importantly, is the black sediment. So you can see the river looks a little black, and particularly in these areas, it's kind of a dark area. So that's actually where that sediment that we're trying to model is traveling down the river. So we injected at Donaldsonville at the very head of waters of our area, not the headwaters of the Mississippi, but where our model starts. And that sediment was chosen based on its properties and density. So it behaves just like river sand does in the real Mississippi River. So you got to play with the densities and the particle size. So it's very lightweight plastic. But at those scaled flow rates, when you scale down the flow rates of the river, it responds just as sediment does, sand does in the real Mississippi River. And you can see some of our students out there working today, taking some measurements of that sediment, the levels of the sediment as it, so we do a run, we run water and sediment through the river. Typically an hour run is kind of what we do. And 1 hour replicates about a year in the real world. And that's one of the important things about the physical model, is that we can study not just what's going to happen in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but what we do is typically 50-year runs. So 50 years down the road, how is the Mississippi River responding to those diversions that we're cutting in and altering the flow rates, altering the sediment that's in there, and how that maybe is going to impact other diversions that we build, if we can build them in other locations. How is that going to impact the transportation industry, right? We use these shipping channels. We're actually going to be deepening the river to 50 feet to allow more larger ships to carry produce and goods up and down the Mississippi River. So how do all those different dynamics work together? And the physical model is just another way that we can understand more about that, and then also compare that to, say, computer models, for instance. Are we seeing the same results in our computer models that we're seeing in the physical model, among some other things? So the only other thing I will point out is some of the acoustic sensors that we have out there. You may be able to see those little telephone pole looking devices, maybe a little tough to see. And so those are just measuring water levels in the Mississippi River. Now, those are interesting because we have those same, not the exact type of sensor, but we have sensors on the real Mississippi River at those exact same locations. And that's one of the reasons, one of the ways that we made HCR model was working and behaving like the real Mississippi River. We've run historical runs, historical flow rates coming down the river, and we compare that to real data that was collected and see how closely we're matching up to make sure that our model is accurately reflecting that, right? That's the whole point of a physical model.
What do they use to measure the water level?
It's just an acoustic sensor. It just has a sound wave, and I believe it just the time it takes that sound wave to go from the sensor back up. That's how it's pretty simple. Now, what they're doing is measuring the sediment, and I think at this point they just use some calipers to do that. We have some strung out instruments over on the left side. Those are maybe some new ways that we have of measuring sediment. I don't know the exact way that it measures it, but it would be remotely as opposed to the students going out there old school with pen and pad and looking at the caliper and measuring it. So we do have a few. We have all the diversions in the 2017 master plan carved into the model, and we just basically plug those as we wish to study them. We also have the Bonnie Carey spillway, so a very important flood control structure along the Mississippi River. It's a little bit more towards New Orleans, like Pontchartrain area. Some of you guys may have drove over that if you're going on the interstate to New Orleans. And we actually operate that in just as they would in the real world. So our structure looks a little different, but the concept is the same. It just kind of takes a lot of water. It's an extreme amount of water off the Mississippi River to kind of protect the city of New Orleans and the levees around New Orleans. And you can actually zoom in on Mid-Barataria. So that's the first diversion. So that's correct. Yeah. So it doesn't exist yet in the real world, but it's here on the model, and they've obviously been operating it. You can see the sediment that's coming into that area, and that's the whole point: introducing in a safe way sediment into those areas for long-term effects, right? So as you learn downstairs, we have different types of projects that rebuild land. A lot of times what we have to do is dredge the river or go off the coast and dredge that off the bottom of the ocean or the coast, and then pump that back to an area and kind of manually rebuild it that way. Now, when you remove that dredge, a lot of times it, almost not a lot of times, but all the time, it continues to subside and erode from, waves coming off the coast or storms. But with the diversions, it's more of a reconnecting a process, right? You're creating something that's going to last 50, 100 years, as opposed to spending $12 million and building a marsh that's going to continue to subside. Those diversions are very expensive and a little bit controversial. So, for instance, Mid-Barataria is about a $1.2 billion project. Mid-Breton, just north of there, is another $800 million project. And they will have some different effects on the environment, right? For instance, when you introduce a lot of fresh water into those areas that were maybe historically brackish or more saline marsh, things are going to change, right? Where you can catch fish, where you can harvest oysters. So those are some of the issues that kind of surround those things. So it's not just a one easy solution, right? But those are all the different things that we had to think about, and kind of as these environments are changing, what might you could sacrifice, or what changes we have to deal with to, make this a more sustainable coast and working coast for the future.
There's been an environmental impact statement through the release with the Mid-Barataria, right?
That's correct. So the environmental impact statement actually will be coming out Friday, I believe. So that's a big report, and it's going to kind of be more of the detailed data on how exactly these diversions will be impacting the economy in those areas, and floodwaters, and
Adam had a question: what makes these diversions so expensive?
So for a couple things. So the structures are very, very large, maybe a 1 mile conveyance channel structure, concrete. So you have to wall off the Mississippi River and kind of the coastal areas, and then build that structure, and then take down that outside structure that allows you to build it. There's going to be gates on either side, so you're having to build gates that make sure that the river doesn't flood it at times if you don't want it to. You also have to build gates on the other side to keep flooding from coastal areas out of there. There's a railroad system that goes through there, so a railway. There's also a highway that runs over there, so you have to build bridges that go across those channels. And just making sure that we're in compliance with the Corps and their standards that they have for the levees on either side. So Yeah, if he comes down, we might could turn the projectors on. I don't want to turn them on while he's up there, but yeah. Yeah, so we have a very, very good, unique projector system that was integrated. It has nothing to do with the research aspect of the center or the model, but it's really cool because we can, as you can see, the model is white for the most part, and we can project down images onto the surface. So now that he's down, I might could run over there and ask him just to see. Were there any questions that anyone had?
That was the only, oh wait. One more. No, that was the only one so far.
Okay. Well, if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer anything that I can. But I'm gonna maybe run down there and see if we can turn the projector. And if not, we'll come back and let you guys come see it. It's we'll show you pictures and it's really cool, but being here in person is really amazing. I think it's one of the coolest things, and I would say in Baton Rouge. So hopefully you guys will have the opportunity to come out and see us.
You can hold on to it. Can you explain what you said about the projector too?
Yeah, so we can't turn the projectors on, unfortunately, for you guys today. We had an issue with one of them, and so they were getting some critical messages. So I don't think they were quite sure that if they could turn it on successfully or not. So we're just going to hold off. So hopefully you guys are able to come see us. I can send some pictures. We've got some really high definition pictures of the model with the projectors on, which is really cool. But like I said, in person here, seeing it in person is worth coming out. I really believe that. So yeah, so we could schedule you guys at any time. We also do, before COVID happened, we were doing some first free Sundays. First Sunday in the month, we kind of have a couple hours of open house, if you will. So if you can't come during the class, don't ever schedule or can't come, we will be probably starting that up. But I can pass along that information. But so to the question that was about the students, so most of our students are almost exclusively, all of them are engineering students in some capacity. So I think a majority of them are civil, with maybe a few environmental engineers. So I think the two of them we're seeing are undergraduate students, and then the other two are graduate students now. So and most of these students have been with us for probably a couple of years. So Dr. Clint Wilson is who kind of runs the center. So they're almost all exclusively his students, and he is in professor of civil engineering at LSU. So and he was at one point he was at LaVille Hall, I believe. It's maybe the honors college.
Yeah, honors college.
He lived, I think he lived there. So I don't know if any of the students or honors college students may have met him or known. He's kind of a personality around LSU. A lot of people know. So a great teacher if you ever get a chance to meet him. So.
They love the giant model.
If you got more time, or if we need to do other things, we can head downstairs if you guys want to maybe see some of
Oh, that would be
the
cool.
pump systems and
Yeah,
not at all. Let's. So this is actually a good place to kind of just show a few things. So this is actually how we carved the model. So each panel, the actual model is made up of 216 individual pieces that we had to actually glue together, even though it looks like a seamless one single unit. So carve those out. You can kind of see the different stages and eventually painted it. This was the acoustic sensor that I was talking about earlier. So it sends down a sound wave into the river, whatever height that water is, it then sends it back up and measures that distance.
They're learning about larger versions of these, but
Okay.
teeny tiny acoustic sensor.
Yeah. And this is actually the diversion channel. So we don't have the gates, obviously, on this one. On our model, though, we do have gates. So the idea is for the water and sediment, it's a deeper structure, and that water and sediment would be flowing through there out into the marsh. So not all the tours get to come behind the scenes, but we'll show you guys some cool stuff.
Well, thank you.
Of course. So I don't think they're actually doing a run right now. No, the water's not moving right now, but on a normal run, the water actually comes from the head box here, which we control the flow rate. We have a large pump system that controls that. Then we have our sediment injection system, which is injecting the sediment at a certain rate. So when we do a run, like when I said, 1 hour is equal to a year, we do seasonal changes as well. So typically in the kind of the late summer, early fall, the river's a lot lower. There's less water coming from the watershed. It's making its way into the river. And when that happens, there's less sediment flowing through, because that sediment takes certain velocities to actually mobilize the particles of sand to get it suspended in the water column. And so we model those changes. So for instance, around this time of the year, early summer, springtime, the river obviously swells up. You're having some snow melt in those other areas. There's a lot of water making its way into the Mississippi River watershed, into the river. And so it's typically there's more sand and particles moving through it. So we model all of those seasonal changes as well. And we control that all here. We've got kind of computer monitors, that control that. We've got all our gauges that are picking up all the data and sensors and things like that. So
They want to know, is there a specific date when these diversions are expected to be open?
Um,
We'll talk about that a little bit in class, but I don't know if you know.
I want to say that mid-barataria may be, I want to say 2023 sounds right, but I could be wrong. Yeah. And that's subject to change. I'm not really sure, depending on obviously some the funding's all there, but the permitting process and all of that kind of stuff is, I'm not as familiar with all of that. So one good thing was I think they streamlined everything, so the engineering and the EIS, all that could happen at the same time. So that was an important step that they did a couple of years ago. And then mid-Breton will be probably a couple of years, maybe 5-6 years after that, is my understanding. I think it's in engineering and design right now as well. This is actually some of the sediment that we use. So like I said, it's just a lightweight plastic. It almost feels like coffee grounds. We use a lot of that material on the model. Obviously, when we get to the end of a 50-year run, they take shot backs, as you can see some of the vacuums over there.
Yeah.
And they lower the water levels and get out there and suck up all the sediment. So we reuse that sediment. And then the dirty work happens. As you can imagine, when you leave water out there for a month or so, it gets kind of nasty, little algae forms. We do add some different things to try to combat that, but it's still pretty gross. So those are not always the greatest days to work out at the model here for the students.
Last
But
time I was here, I saw some students scrubbing algae.
yeah, got a lot of scrubbing happens. So it's all hands on deck typically when we do that.
Yeah, for sure. Very cool. Well, I think I'll leave it open until class is done for questions, and I can always find Joe and ask him questions. But yeah, that's probably the end of the tour. All right, so I think we're gonna end the tour there. I've got the mic again, and I'll keep monitoring chat for questions. I can always find Joe and ask him questions if you guys ask something I can't answer. I'll shut off the camera and go back up top, and if you guys want me to zoom in on anything, I can do that. So I do a little bit of work related to this effort. I am I'm involved in some of the projects to create new marsh, specifically the impacts of the dredging that has to happen to create the new marsh on the ecosystem. In terms of the diversions, I am currently doing some monitoring of my own, so I can have a close look at the impacts on the food web after the diversions are implemented. It's kind of a huge, like, ecological experiment. It's definitely the biggest restoration project that's ever been attempted. So it's super interesting. Is there anything you guys want to see again? This work looks like a lot of fun, doesn't it? It's like the adult equivalent of playing in the sandbox or the water table. Yeah, I know. I know. It looks super fun. Alrighty, well, if you guys don't want to see anything again and you don't have any questions, I'll go ahead and end the field trip. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to make this available as a video. So if you want to revisit anything, and there are definitely some concepts that we talked about today that we'll talk about more in class, especially as we prepare for your final project.